Flying Scotsman. You've probably heard of it. You may have even heard it. And now you'll never hear again. So many documentaries refer to this as one of the most famous locomotives in the world, which I think is a huge understatement. I think it is 100% the world's most famous locomotive, recognised from far beyond the many places it's travelled, and this is only one of its world records. It's probably a world record in itself in how many records one engine holds. Most famous, most well travelled, first to officially go 100 miles an hour and therefore once the world's fastest, first to circumnavigate the globe, and performed the longest non-stop run for a steam loco. Least to mention, most expensive loco ever. The 24th of February 2022 marks 100 years since Flying Scotsman took to the rails. And boy, has it developed a reputation since it left Doncaster Works. This is Sir Nigel Gresley, Chief Mechanical Engineer of the Great Northern Railway, who asked him to develop an express engine to replace the struggling Atlantics on the East Coast Main Line. Gresley soon discovered that a Pacific would be better than an Atlantic, but then he crossed the Atlantic himself just to make sure. His ocean knowledge must have been better than his grasp of numbering and lettering, because he took notes from the new Pennsylvania Railroad K4 class and came up with two Class A1s. Work that one out. It's 1922 and the GNR has been merged into the new London and North Eastern Railway. As Chief Mechanical Engineer, Gresley's designs suddenly had a lot more work cut out for them. Flying Scotsman was the third built, but spent the first year of its life with just the number 1472, as the LNER couldn't decide what name or number they wanted either. Then came the Great British Show-Off Competition of 1924 and 5, where the marketing team realised they could make some serious money. The newly named Flying Scotsman, now 4472, was unveiled at the exhibition alongside the likes of the Great Western Railway's Pendennis Castle, a Southern Railway N-Class, an LMS Baltic tank, and a mix of other smaller locos and tube cars, including this little Bagley diesel which is now preserved at the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum on the Talislin Railway. Aww. A little bit suspicious of each other, the LNER and GWR decided to swap notes too, and exchanged an A1 with Pendennis Castle, to see which one was better. Still bitter about City of Truro only being rumoured to have gone 100 miles an hour, the Great Western were all smug when the Castle proved better as Britain's most powerful express loco. Gresley was soon drawing up what he'd learnt into his own designs. The result was the A3 class, which was just an A1, but with a new, more superheated boiler with alterations to the cylinders, and going against the Great Western, it was also swapped to left-hand drive. Flying Scotsman was refitted as such in 1928, when it also gained a new tender, with a corridor going under the coal and water. The famous express that Flying Scotsman was named after, the Flying Scotsman, was going to be made a non-stop service from London King's Cross to Edinburgh, and a corridor tender meant that the loco crews could swap shifts with another, waiting in the carriages. Originally taking 8.5 hours, the non-stop A3s shortened an hour off of the journey time for the Flying Scotsman, with 4472 being the first to complete it. But Gresley wasn't done being smug yet. The LNER made full use of Flying Scotsman as their flagship engine, letting it take centre stage in the 1929 film of the same name. This included a chase sequence along the side of the train, filmed completely in camera. On the 30th of November 1933, Flying Scotsman undertook another special train. The LNER wanted to introduce a 3-car diesel service to run at high speeds, but Gresley's team wanted to prove that steam could do it better, with double the coaches too. Flying Scotsman clocked in at 100 miles an hour, forever making Great Western fans wish they never let them play with Pendennis Castle. In World War II, Flying Scotsman was painted in wartime black and renumbered, first the 502 and then 103, for seemingly no reason whatsoever, which led it to having the BR number of 60103. To better match the free steaming abilities of the later A4s, it was given a Kyle Chap double exhaust and chimney, with the unintended side effect of causing the smoke to also be free. So, German-styled smoke deflectors were fitted to keep it clear from the driver's vision. Having spent its entire life based at King's Cross Top Shed, and aware of its inevitable retirement, in BR days Flying Scotsman spent some time living in Leicester Central and Grantham, and it also wore Express Passenger Blue before committing to Brunswick Green. However, even with the introduction of diesels to the East Coast, it appears that this was merely a midlife crisis for the engine, because it had a surprising fate ahead. In 1962, British Railways announced that the loco would be scrapped. How it evaded being preserved by the National Collection, I have no idea, but the A3 Preservation Society began plans to rescue it instead. The recently rich Alan Pegler stepped in to provide the funds to buy it, and Flying Scotsman was sent back to Doncaster Works after running its last train on the 15th of January 1963. It was refitted and repainted back to Eleanor Apple Green, where it had been built all those years ago. The idea to preserve Flying Scotsman was supported by Prime Minister Mr. Wilson, whose ministers permitted Pegler's team to run on the main line until the end of 1971. When BR banned steam in 1968, this contract made Flying Scotsman the only engine to bypass this rule. But the removal of water towers, coaling stages and turntables made things difficult. Pegler had a second tender for Flying Scotsman, converted in 1966 to boost water capacity. But the increasing running restrictions made him look elsewhere to play his trains. He convinced the Prime Minister again to send Flying Scotsman to America with a patriotic train to promote British trade, like the Great British Show-Off competition but on tour. So in 1968 the engine was booted with a cowcatcher, a big old lamp, Buckeye couplings, air brakes, a bell and a chime whistle, and was shipped off across the Atlantic. Gresley would be proud, especially because it was due to come back home in 2 years, right? Right? On American soil, the tour ran from Boston, Massachusetts to Houston, Texas, with great success, stopping for days at a time in different states. However, back home, Mr. Heath had become the new Prime Minister of the UK, and his ministers weren't so keen to keep funding the excursion. Someone who was still keen was Alan Pegler, dreaming of driving Flying Scotsman across the continent, which he wouldn't be permitted to do on British Railways metals. A revised schedule saw them steam firstly north to Wisconsin, Canada, then east to Toronto, south to Niagara Falls, and then finally westwards, all the way to San Francisco. Having travelled over 15,000 miles, it had finally reached its destination and was displayed on the famous Fisherman's Wharf. But then, local restaurants soon kicked up a fuss because they weren't benefiting from the train blocking their sight, so Pegler had to move to a quieter part of the city, and the money stopped coming in. Alan Pegler eventually went bankrupt, but before he did, he secured a deal to secretly move Flying Scotsman to the Sharp Army Depot, to prevent debt collectors from taking it away. Even then, it was almost inevitable that Flying Scotsman would either be scrapped or sold to a large corporation to regain the losses. In either scenario, it looked like it would never return to the UK. Hang in there, Queen Mary. Still thinking of you. At the 11th hour, entrepreneur William McAlpine, now owner of Pendennis Castle, stepped in to buy Flying Scotsman and prevent such a fate. Ditching the coaches, It was snuck across the bay, and people were bribed to not tell the debt collectors. Then loaded onto the deck of a ship and set to sea. It was the first steam engine to use the Panama Canal, and defying all odds, it eventually sailed into Liverpool, England, 3.5 years after it had left. Defying all odds again, despite its condition, it steamed itself over to Derby Works, where it was restored to run tours in the UK once more. Now, considering that lucky escape, picture this. In a completely bold move, McAlpine agreed to send Flying Scotsman to feature in the Australian Steam Festival of 1988. They'd wanted Mallard instead, but the National Railway Museum were playing with that, so Flying Scotsman was the backup option. It travelled over 28,000 miles on tours with all sorts of strange combinations with Australian engines, including Australia's most famous engine, 3801. Bizarrely, it even reunited with Pendennis Castle, which had been brought to run tours there in 1977. Imagine not being able to escape your arch nemesis on the other side of the world after everything they've been through. Ah, what a rivalry. Flying Scotsman decided to one-up the castle for old time's sake, and set another world record. It ran non-stop for 422 miles between Parks and Broken Hill, the longest distance ever for a steam engine. Then proceeded to haul the heaviest train it had ever taken, of 735 tons, between Tarcoola and Alice Springs in the same trip. This time, its adventures abroad had a happy ending. The loco returned home weary but safe in December 1989, where it was overhauled into its BR condition. However, just like Alan Pegler, McAlpine went bankrupt and agreed to share ownership of their new Flying Scotsman Railways company with Pete Waterman. It wasn't to be though, as the engine derailed at the Llangollen Railway, developed a crack in the boiler and had to be withdrawn and put up for sale again in 1996. Enter entrepreneur number 4, Tony Marchington, who spent £1 million to see Flying Scotsman return to the mainline in 1999. Like so many rumoured UK theme parks, Marchington planned to make a Flying Scotsman village in Edinburgh, but the council said no, and as was tradition at this point, Marchington went bankrupt in 2003. Surely it would take a lot of bravery for anyone to want to purchase this engine after all of the people it had made bankrupt. Well, due to its now world famous track record, the National Railway Museum wanted to make sure this loco's future would be secured. With support from the National Lottery Fund, the Yorkshire Post, Richard Branson, and donations from the public, £2.3 million was spent to save what is now referred to as the People's Engine. Phew! It was nearly as expensive as buying a model of Flying Scotsman by an also 100-year-old company, but at least now the NRM could run the engine on rail tours. Right? Oh no. After a few rail tours, it was withdrawn in 2005 to undergo an overhaul which would last just 1 year. 6 years later, after many more faults were found in the very worn-out loco, Flying Scotsman was triumphantly unveiled in its wartime black livery in 2011, ready for a victorious return to the rails. Where is it? Cracks in the frames were just one hint that the repair work needed was greatly underestimated. It took a few more years of work before the NRM decided to send Flying Scotsman to Riley & Sons to finish the job properly. Firstly in wartime black and now in BR Brunswick green, Flying Scotsman finally returned on the 8th of January 2016. 10 years and £4.5 million later. Needless to say, the NRM must have been very eager to run some problem-free trains with their most expensive working exhibit at long last. One day after its 93rd birthday, on the 25th of February 2016, the inaugural tour saw the Flying Scotsman recreate the Flying Scotsman from London as far as York. Overeager enthusiasts swarmed the line like flies, and the train had to stop several times because of trespassers on the track. A problem which has plagued the engine ever since. As per his wishes, Flying Scotsman hauled a belated funeral train for Alan Pegler in 2018, where his ashes were thrown into the firebox. And the following year, a train was also run in memory of William McAlpine. The engine is now an icon for train travel overall, and it's taken part in countless publicity stunts and ceremonies as a result. Even if there's hardly anything left of the original engine, after all of the repairs it's needed, Flying Scotsman is almost always the engine that comes to mind first. In 2022, it was given an intermediate overhaul in preparation for its 100th anniversary in 2023, seeing it ready to be steaming for another 10 years. After that, whether the National Railway Museum will decide to keep it in the museum is unknown. But if history is anything to go by, then the end is never definitive for Flying Scotsman. Happy 100th birthday. Oh yeah, Flying Scotsman is also in the Railway series, and Thomas the Tank Engine a few times, because canonically Gordon is a prototype for the A1 class, so he's technically Flying Scotsman's brother? Yeah. If you enjoyed this video, then there's a whole guide rail playlist for more of the world's steam-powered history. And if you become a patron for this channel by following the link in the description, then you can join our Discord server and get to watch every video long before everyone else. There's no £4.5 million Flying Scotsman tier, but £1, £5 and £10 tiers with a whole different range of exclusive rewards. Ta-ra for now! Huge thanks to my brilliant patrons: Alex Goodman, GBH Train, D0280 Falcon, Sean Tempest, Nat, Alco, Random Thomas Fan, Peter Davenport, Ego, and Kildane's Coven.